And when it's over, Giacomo will have confessed to crimes that never happened, named friends who are innocent, and begged for a death that will be denied to him with scientific precision. Before we descend into this darkness together, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. It amazes me that stories this brutal, this hidden, somehow reach people everywhere who want to understand what we're capable of. The torturer's name is recorded in the prison ledger. Lorenzo Di Marco. He inherited this position from his father, who learned it from his father before him. 3 generations of expertise in the precise calibration of human suffering. Lorenzo has done this 512 times. He knows exactly how much pain the body can endure before the mind shatters completely. He knows the precise moment when a person stops being a person and becomes simply meat that screams, and he knows that moment is still many hours away for Giacomo. What Lorenzo cannot know, what no one in that chamber in 1486 can possibly know, is that archaeologists will discover this room 531 years later. They will find instruments so sophisticated in their cruelty that modern engineers will struggle to understand their full function. They will find bones with marks that tell stories of suffering so prolonged that forensic specialists will require psychological counseling after completing their analysis. They will find records, meticulous records, documentation of every session in handwriting so steady it suggests the scribe felt nothing while recording agony in administrative language. Here is what you need to understand before we go further. Everything you think you know about medieval torture is incomplete. Not because it was less brutal than you imagine, because it was more systematic, more scientific, more incomprehensibly refined than popular culture has ever shown you. The devices you've seen in museums, the Iron Maidens and racks and thumbscrews, those were common tools. What I'm about to reveal goes far beyond those familiar horrors into territory that medieval authorities themselves considered so extreme that records were often destroyed to prevent public knowledge. The sleep deprivation begins simply. For the first 3 days, guards prevent the victim from sleeping by poking them with sticks whenever their eyes close. This is the crude beginning. But what comes after is where medieval understanding of human psychology becomes terrifying. A woman named Caterina di Siena was subjected to this in 1289. She was accused of practicing Jewish rituals in secret. The Inquisition wanted names. She refused to confess because she was genuinely Catholic and had committed no crime. By day 4, Caterina was hallucinating, seeing demons materialize in the corners of her cell, hearing voices that commanded her to confess. By day 7, she no longer recognized her own sister when she was brought to visit. By day 9, she confessed to crimes that were physically impossible, describing rituals that no actual Jewish practice included, naming people who did not exist. Her mind generated an elaborate fantasy to make the sleeplessness stop. But here is what made this technique truly monstrous. The inquisitors did not accept her confession. A confession obtained under torture was considered legally unreliable. So they let Caterina sleep for 2 days, waited for her mind to partially recover, and then asked her to confirm her confession voluntarily. When she recanted, explaining that she had invented everything, they began again. This cycle repeated for 13 weeks. Sleep deprivation until psychosis. Brief recovery. Request for confirmation, recantation. More deprivation. By the end, Caterina existed in a state that modern psychiatrists would recognize as permanent dissociative disorder. She confirmed her confession not because she was tortured into it, but because she genuinely no longer knew what was real. She had confessed so many times that the false memories had overwritten her actual memories. She believed she was guilty because her mind could no longer access the truth. Records from the Toledo Inquisition show that sleep deprivation had a 91% confession rate, compared to 64% for physical torture alone. More importantly, these confessions were considered more legally valid because victims appeared to confess voluntarily after their recovery period. The technique spread across Europe within decades, adopted by secular authorities who recognized its devastating effectiveness. What happened to Katerina? She was burned at the stake in 1290 after confirming her confession. Her children were taken by the church, her property was seized, and her case became a template applied to thousands of others over the following 3 centuries. The instrument looks almost elegant. Polished metal shaped like a pear, small enough to fit in a torturer's palm. A screw mechanism at the base causes 4 segments to separate when turned. The pear of anguish was inserted into body cavities. For men accused of sodomy, it was rectal. For women accused of sexual crimes, it was vaginal. For those accused of heresy or blasphemy, it was oral. Once inserted, the torturer would slowly turn the screw, expanding the segments millimeter by millimeter until tissue tore. A court record from Lyon dated 1334 describes the interrogation of a woman named Marguerite. The document is clinical in its detail, recording that the pear was expanded over a period of 6 hours. With expansion halted whenever Marguerite lost consciousness and resumed once she was revived. The stated purpose was extracting the names of other women who had committed adultery. The actual purpose, evident from the document's almost gleeful tone, was punishment through suffering that would leave permanent damage. What makes this instrument particularly horrifying is its precision. The expansion was controlled through gear mechanisms that allowed adjustments of fractions of millimeters. Torturers could maintain a victim at the edge of tissue failure for extended periods, maximizing pain while preventing the merciful release of severe injury. Some variants included spikes on the expanding segments that would embed in flesh, making any movement cause additional damage. Modern gynecologists who have examined surviving pairs have noted that the design exploits anatomical knowledge that supposedly exceeded medieval medical understanding. The instruments were engineered to apply pressure to nerve clusters while avoiding major blood vessels that would cause rapid death. This was not random cruelty. This was cruelty designed with anatomical expertise. A craftsman in Venice named Lorenzo Borelli became famous for producing custom pairs commissioned by nobility who wanted instruments suited to specific purposes. His workshop records, discovered in 1981, show orders specifying dimensions, expansion ratios, and surface textures. Some clients requested religious imagery engraved on the segments so that victims would see saints and angels as the instrument destroyed them from within. The psychological element was considered as important as the physical damage. Imagine a wooden pyramid, roughly 3 feet tall, mounted on a sturdy frame with ropes and pulleys attached to the ceiling above it. The Judas cradle worked through body weight. Victims were stripped naked, suspended by harnesses around their arms and legs, and slowly lowered onto the pyramid's point. They were lowered until the apex pressed against their most sensitive areas, then left to hang with just enough support that their full weight wasn't immediately applied. Over hours, exhaustion would cause their muscles to fail, lowering them further onto the point. The torture was essentially self-inflicted, as the body's inability to maintain suspension caused progressive impalement. A Florentine banker named Aldo Grimaldi experienced the Judas cradle in 1419 after being accused of financial crimes against the Medici family. Court records show he was suspended for 11 hours on the first day, 9 hours on the second, and 13 hours on the third. The confession became irrelevant when he died of infection 18 days later, his internal injuries having become septic despite physicians' attempts at treatment. The genius of the Judas cradle, if such a word can be applied to something so monstrous, was its efficiency. Unlike methods requiring constant attention from torturers, the cradle worked automatically. A single guard could monitor multiple victims simultaneously, only intervening to raise them slightly when unconsciousness threatened to end the session prematurely. The device also left no visible external injuries. Victims could be displayed publicly after interrogation without obvious signs of torture, maintaining the legal fiction that confessions were voluntary. Internal damage was invisible to observers. The breast ripper was exactly what its name suggests. Iron claws, often heated until glowing, attached to handles that allowed torturers to grip and tear breast tissue. The device was used on women accused of adultery, self-induced abortion, heresy, witchcraft, and in some cases, simply for being unmarried past a certain age. A woman named Agnes Bernauer was subjected to the breast ripper in Bavaria in 1435. Her crime was marrying above her station. She was a commoner who had secretly married Duke Albrecht III. When the Duke's father discovered the marriage, he had Agnes arrested on fabricated charges of witchcraft. The torture served no interrogation purpose. There was nothing to confess. The breast ripper was pure punishment for the crime of being a woman who had risen above her assigned place. Agnes survived the initial torture, but was then drowned in the Danube. Her mutilated body displayed as a warning to other women who might imagine themselves worthy of nobility. The breast ripper existed in two main variants. The spider was a fixed position device mounted on walls. The handheld version allowed torturers to attack from multiple angles. Both were often heated before use, combining tearing with burning. What made this device particularly cruel was that it targeted anatomy associated with nurturing and femininity. The destruction was symbolic as much as physical. Women who survived bore scars that marked them permanently as fallen, as punished, as objects of public shame. In an era when women's value was tied to marriage and motherhood, the breast ripper destroyed both possibilities while leaving victims alive to experience the social consequences. The condemned was stripped and spread across a large wooden wheel with arms and legs extended along the spokes. The executioner then used a heavy iron hammer to systematically break every major bone in the body. The sequence was precise and followed written protocols that varied by region. In German territories, the standard sequence was ankles first, then shins, then knees, then thighs, then pelvis, then forearms, then upper arms, then hands. Each bone was struck multiple times with carefully measured force designed to fracture without severing. The entire process took between 45 minutes and 2 hours. A man named Peter Stump was broken on the wheel in Bedburg, Germany in 1589. His crime was supposedly being a werewolf, but his actual crime was probably being an unpopular outsider during a period of hysteria. The court record describes his execution with disturbing precision. First, his skin was torn with red-hot pincers in 10 separate places. Then his limbs were broken on the wheel. Then his arms and legs were removed with an axe. Only then was he beheaded, and finally his body was burned. The entire execution took approximately 3 hours. Stump was conscious for most of it. The wheel was specifically designed to inflict maximum damage while avoiding rapid death. Breaking bones is agonizing but rarely causes immediate death unless major blood vessels are severed. The protocol avoided the heart, the neck, and the major arteries precisely so that victims would remain alive and aware throughout. After the bones were shattered, the body was woven through the wheel's spokes, threading ruined limbs between the wooden bars to create a display. The wheel was then mounted on a tall pole and left in public view. Some victims died within hours from shock. Others survived for days, exposed to elements, their broken bodies unable to move, while birds began feeding on them while they still lived. A French court record from Toulouse documents a man who survived on the wheel for 9 days before finally dying. Each day a priest visited to offer him the opportunity to confess additional sins. Each day he was technically alive, though beyond any possibility of recovery. The priest's diary describes the smell, the sounds, the progressive deterioration of a human body that was no longer really human but not yet permitted to be dead. This technique required no specialized equipment: a bucket, a rat, fire, and time. The victim was restrained on their back, unable to move. A metal bucket or cage was placed on their abdomen, opened side down, with a rat trapped inside. Fire was then applied to the outside of the container, heating the metal and the air within. The rat, desperate to escape the heat, would dig downward through the only soft surface available: human flesh. A political prisoner in the Tower of London reportedly experienced this torture in 1337. Though records are deliberately vague about identities during this period, what survives is a physician's description of the aftermath. The rat had burrowed completely through the abdominal wall before dying of heat exhaustion inside the body cavity. The victim survived the initial torture but died of infection 19 days later, despite attempts to remove the animal's remains. The psychological element was as devastating as the physical damage. Victims were fully aware of what was happening, but unable to prevent it. They could feel the rat's claws and teeth. They could hear it panicking. They knew exactly what was coming as the heat increased and the animal grew more desperate. Many victims confessed before the fire was even lit, the anticipation proving more effective than actual application. Medieval torturers discovered that smaller rats burrowed faster but caused less damage. Larger rats took longer to begin digging, but created wounds that were almost always fatal. The choice of rat became a decision about whether the torture's purpose was confession or death. Some records indicate that pregnant rats were preferred because their desperation to protect offspring made them dig more frantically. The heretic's fork was simply a metal rod with 2-pronged forks at each end. It was worn by victims with one fork pressed under the chin and the other against the sternum, held in place by a leather strap around the neck. The forks prevented any movement of the head or neck. Looking down pushed the lower fork into the chest. Looking up drove the upper fork into the throat. Speaking caused both forks to dig into flesh. Swallowing did the same. Even breathing required careful control to minimize the constant pressure of metal against skin. Victims wearing the heretic's fork could not sleep because any relaxation of neck muscles caused injury. They could not eat because chewing was impossible. They could not speak to confess even if they wanted to. They existed in a state of exhausted tension every moment, requiring conscious effort to avoid additional pain. A woman accused of witchcraft in Bavaria in 1590 wore the heretic's fork for 11 days before her execution. Court records note that by the end she could no longer stand, could not speak coherently, and had lost significant blood from wounds where the forks had slowly pressed through skin into underlying tissue. She confessed by nodding, the only movement that did not cause the forks to dig deeper. The heretic's fork was often engraved with the Latin word abjuro, meaning I recant. Victims would see this word constantly during their ordeal, a reminder that confession would end the suffering. The psychological pressure of escape being so close, requiring only capitulation, combined with the physical reality that speaking to recant would cause immediate additional pain. The device created a trap where relief required action that itself caused suffering. The year is 1486 again. We return to where we began. Giacomo is still hanging in that chamber beneath Milan. For days have passed. He has confessed to everything they wanted. He has named people who will be arrested tomorrow. People who are innocent, people whose own torture will begin because Giacomo's body could no longer endure what Lorenzo di Marco knew how to inflict with 3 generations of inherited expertise. When archaeologists discovered that chamber in 2017, they found something unexpected among the instruments and bones. A journal, Lorenzo's journal. In it, he recorded not just the administrative details of torture sessions, but his thoughts. On one page, dated 3 months before Giacomo's ordeal, Lorenzo wrote, "The body breaks in predictable ways. It is the mind that surprises. Some minds invent elaborate stories. Some minds simply stop. I have learned to recognize which will do which within the first hour. This knowledge is what my father gave me. This knowledge is what I will give my son. Lorenzo had a son. His son had a son." The family profession continued for 4 more generations until the practice was finally outlawed. But the knowledge did not disappear. It evolved. It was adapted. It continued under different names in different contexts. The Milan chamber held not criminals, but people who threatened power. Torture served as public control, not truth. Lorenzo's journal shows fear kept the city quiet. The chamber is empty now, its tools sanitized in museums. Yet the knowledge of how to break people endures, reshaped but never erased.